Greetings and welcome back to our Bible study on Mark's Gospel. Today we are in chapter 8 and verses 1 through 21. This section begins with Jesus still in Gentile territory. He came into Gentile territory in the last chapter. You remember the Syrophoenician woman and her daughter, where Jesus sets the woman up in a game of wits, a battle of wits, and she proves victorious. And Jesus uses that as an illustration to his disciples that the Gentiles are included in some way in the kingdom of God. Here we have the feeding of the 4,000, where it sets up exactly the same as the feeding of the 5,000 from a couple of chapters ago. In fact, the disciples seem to ask the same questions as if they have not learned anything. And this has led some to believe that this story is fabricated because the disciples who had already seen the feeding of the 5,000 would not have asked the same questions at the feeding of the 4,000. And that is true. The disciples, if they had seen the feeding of the 5,000, would not probably ask the same questions of Jesus at the feeding of the 4,000. If they saw another group of people who were hungry and Jesus was saying, "What are we going to do?" the disciples aren't going to say the same things that they said at the feeding of the 5,000 because they knew Jesus could heal or could feed this many people. So it seems a little odd that the disciples play the same cards that they played the first time. This has led some to say, well, this story never happened because Mark is just copying the feeding of the 5,000 and putting it in twice. That's a very simplistic approach. I don't think Mark would have looked at the story that way. If he would have just copied this, I don't think he would have looked at it and gone, yeah, that's a great story. I'm going to repeat the exact same thing twice. We don't see that in this story. We don't see it anywhere in this story. So why is Mark adding this story and having the disciples say the same things? Well, because what Jesus is doing is much like the story with the Syrophoenician woman. He's getting us to ask the question, what is he going to do for the Gentiles? And by having the disciples say pretty much the same things that they said the first time and having the story revolve around Jesus using bread and a few fish the same way with the same result, that 4,000 people are fed and baskets are left over, it's saying that Jesus is going to do the same for the Gentiles that he did for the Jews. The whole section here from that start with the Syrophoenician woman until now is about how are the Gentiles going to relate to Jesus' kingdom, Jesus' reign. What are they going to, where is their place in God's economy? And Jesus is saying they have the same place. I'm going to provide them with food the same way that I provided the Jews with food. I am going to give them healing and exorcism the way that I have given Jews healing and exorcism. And what the disciples are doing is showing us ourselves. We are meant to approach this section putting ourselves in the disciples' shoes, as we are with really the whole gospel. We are the disciples. So we approach this story putting ourselves in the disciples' place and saying, Jesus, what are you going to do for these Gentiles? Now, the disciples aren't asking it that way. Mark is much too subtle to have the disciples just ask, hey, what are you going to do with these Gentiles? Are you going to treat them like Jews? Instead, he's going to have them show the same ignorance that they showed the first time Jesus was in this situation. Their ignorance is repeated because it allows us to ask the question, is Jesus going to treat them the same way that he did the first crowd? And the answer obviously is yes. Jesus wants to provide for them the same way he provided for the others. What is significant here, and I think I said this last video that about the feeding of the 5,000, Some scholars will talk about the basket's shape and size and what it could hold. I don't think that's the significant element. I think rather what is significant and what Jesus is showing and demonstrating is not the size or shape of the basket, it's the number. In the first feeding miracle, Jesus feeds the 5,000 and it's Jews, and there are 12 baskets left over. 12 meaning the fullness of Israel, the completion of Israel. Israel is complete in his feeding, and he is going to feed the whole of Israel. Here we have the nations outside of Israel, the Gentiles. Gentiles is just a word that means nations outside of Israel. People groups. Nations for us today has a geopolitical sense that it did not have in Jesus' time. Nations doesn't necessarily represent independent sovereign states or sovereign kingdoms. It represents people groups. So what Jesus is saying is all of the people groups will come and sit down, and I will feed them all. And in that we will have seven, that is seven loaves and 7 baskets, is completion. All of God's kingdom will be complete, just like God's creation was complete after 7 days. So after 7 days, creation was complete. Now 7 loaves will feed all of the nations, and everything will be complete in Jesus. And there will even be a complete amount left over. There's an abundance for all. This is the message of the feeding of the 4,000, is that Jesus' kingdom is completed when the Gentiles come in and eat, just like the Jews had come in and eaten. So he leaves the Gentile nations fed the way he had left the Jews. And he goes back to the Jews where he encounters the Pharisees. And here, the Pharisees ask Jesus for a sign from heaven. A sign that he is who he says he is. He has the authority of heaven the way he claims. Give us a sign. Now, we, the reader, have just seen Jesus feed 4,000 people, heal the deaf man. We have seen him feed 5,000 people. We have seen him heal the lame in front of the Pharisees. We have seen him exorcise multitude of demons. We have seen him heal the leper. We have seen him do all of these signs. And Mark includes this right here for a very specific reason, because you have now seen all the signs. You are supposed to approach Jesus and ask, am I a Pharisee or am I a disciple? The next 2 stories kind of play off of each other and set us up for part 2. The Pharisees are coming to Jesus saying, give us a definitive sign. Give us something that we can hang our hats on to say, you are from heaven. And Jesus responds in a way that makes it sound on a surface level like he's bashing the Pharisees for being cautious or not seeing him the way he wants to be seen. On a surface level, there is a reality to say, well, Jesus is performing these miracles, but the Pharisees are really, they're struggling, they're looking for something, they're being they're trying to come to Jesus, looking for Jesus to prove himself in a way that is definitive. And that is not really what the text is trying to say, because the subtlety of the text is that the Pharisees are being very combative here. They are trying to come to Jesus and dismiss everything he's done and actually say, all of the healings that you've done, all of the miracles that you've worked, we need a sign to prove that those aren't satanic. We know that you have done all of this, but we need a sign to say this comes from God. They're being combative. They're trying to downplay Jesus in the eyes of the people around him. This is not a good faith argument, and it's subtle. Mark is consistently subtle. So it's very easy to miss some of this. And I think Mark wants that, because Mark is trying to say that some of this is is very subtle, and that it's easy to miss who Jesus is, and it's easy to overlook some of this stuff. And it takes true faith to come in and say, well, here is who Jesus is, and to recognize what he's doing. Mark's trying to use that subtlety to get us to question and go, oh, am I seeing Jesus the right way? This is part of Mark helping us to develop wisdom. But the Pharisees are being somewhat combative here, and Jesus is saying not just, no, I'm not going to do anything for you now. In fact, if I perform a sign, may God curse me. If I do something, if I give in to you in this way, may God curse me. This generation is not going to get a sign. Now, in Matthew 12, that phrase is extended to say, this generation will not receive a sign except for the sign of Jonah. Just as Jonah was in the whale or in the fish for 3 days and 3 nights, so the Son of Man will be in the earth. And we can deal with that in Matthew, but that is not in Mark. Did Jesus say this multiple times? Possibly. Did he have a shorter version and a longer version? That's possible. We don't know. If we're dealing with Matthew, we deal with what Matthew writes and how that reflects on what Matthew is writing and what he's saying. We don't know enough to say that this event and that event are identical and that one of them has misremembered the event. We have what is in front of us, and that is Jesus saying that you're not going to get a sign. In fact, if I give you a sign, may God curse me. It would be an accurate translation. That's kind of what's implied by the text, but is not stated explicitly. And so you won't see translators translate it that way, because we go word. Most good translators try to do word for word what the text denotes instead of what the text connotes. Something like the Message might say something along those lines. I didn't look it up, but that's what Jesus is implying here. And he dismisses the Pharisees and he walks away from them. Dismissing them is kind of like dismissing the crowds. He's done with them. This particular group of Pharisees, he's done with. He's not going to give them the benefit of the doubt anymore. He's tried to show them who he is. All they have done is resist. All they have done is ask for more. They are not even holding out the possibility that he is who he is claiming to be. They're not even holding out the possibility that he's right. They are just condemning everything a priori and not giving him any chance to prove himself. And so at some level you have to say, well, it's one thing to question again and again. It is another thing to reject what is being said and done and continue to ask for questions. So at some level you have to if you're going to ask somebody a question, you have to accept what they give as evidence and then question based off of that. The Pharisees aren't doing that. They just come to Jesus again and again demanding the same thing. And Jesus sees in that bad faith actors. And he's going to say that to the disciples in the next passage. The disciples are going across the sea. They've forgotten to bring food. Jesus acknowledges that they've forgotten to bring food and says, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and of Herod. Now, the disciples inexplicably take this as a reference to their lack of food. Who knows how they got there? Mark is kind of simplifying all of this. Again, this is Mark simplifies and makes subtle. So he's oversimplifying the disciples so that they look rather foolish. Again, we're supposed to read into that ourselves, but the disciples look foolish. They look like they are just completely missing Jesus's point. it allows us to say, well, what was Jesus's point? If the disciples would have just understood and let that be that, we wouldn't necessarily think about this. We would just roll with it. Now, Luke says that it's the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. Matthew says it's the teachings. I don't know that either of those are fully the right answers, especially not the way Mark uses this, because Herod is included. If we're just talking about the Pharisees and we're talking about their hypocrisy, sure. Yeah, they are hypocrites. They teach one thing and then don't follow through on that. Their teachings can be a problem. But if we add in Herod, then we have to stop and really ponder this. And this becomes a little bit of a linchpin for a lot of what's going on around this story. This story of Jesus in the boat becomes kind of a point where we can say, oh, this is the larger context. The inclusion of Herod as somebody to watch out for, it changes the implications, because Herod is not religious. Herod is a political authority who, while he is somewhat curious about religion, Herod Antipas seemed to be somewhat curious about John the Baptist and about the Pharisees and all this other stuff. It isn't a genuine religiosity. It is, oh, this is entertainment. Religion has become entertainment for him. Rather, the yeast of Herod, and Herod isn't hypocritical by any means. Herod is Herod. Herod is conniving. He is scheming. He is looking out for himself, and everybody knows it. He's not a hypocrite. He's not saying, he's not telling everybody that, hey, we all should be living one way and then living another. He's very kind of open about, he's looking out for himself. Rather, what Herod brings to the table, the yeast that Herod would bring to the table, is power, political authority. And the Pharisees have that same kind of devotion to power and authority, just from a religious standpoint. We're going to see that in a couple of chapters when Jesus confronts the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees and the temple authorities. He's going to confront them all. And it has nothing to do inherently with their teaching, but their commitment to power, and how they are using their teachings to keep themselves in power and to hold people under their thumb. So when Jesus says to the disciples here, beware of the yeast of Herod and the Pharisees, or the Pharisees and Herod, he is not saying to them, beware of the hypocrisy of the Pharisees or beware of the teachings of the Pharisees. It's beware of being committed to power, being committed to that kind of authority. That kind of power corrupts. Even if you are teaching good things, even if you are trying to live for God, that kind of power and that commitment to maintaining power, that's what corrupts. When you try to be powerful, when you try to be authoritarian, when you try to be the person in charge, it's a corruption. And just like yeast, it gets in, a little can get in, and everything becomes leavened. Whatever batch the yeast gets into, you can't help it. It will spread. It will take over. So be careful of the power and the authority that the Pharisees and Herod are trying to show. Because look at the previous passage. The Pharisees weren't coming at Jesus because their teaching was different or because they were trying to genuinely understand Jesus. They were trying to say, give us authority, give us some sort of sign to prove your authority, your power. They wanted to use their position to undermine Jesus's teaching. They wanted to use their authority and their power to undermine Jesus in the minds of the crowds. And so that's what Jesus is coming after here. And he reminds the disciples, hey, I have provided for you materially. Don't worry about the material. Don't worry about the possessions. Be more careful about what the Pharisees are doing and what power the Pharisees are are trying to wield. The same with Herod, and be careful of those of their power and how you approach that. But also be careful of taking that into yourselves, because when you take that in, it's very, very difficult to get out. And so that's what Jesus is trying to get at with the idea of the Pharisees. Next time we will look at the blind man and how the disciples come to identify Jesus, and how that is radically different from how the Pharisees are approaching Jesus. But here we are again, we're seeing the Gentiles. How is Jesus going to approach the Gentile nations? How are the authorities going to respond to Jesus? And then how are the disciples going to respond to Jesus? And it's all going to culminate with, who is this man? And then once we understand who Jesus is, we will start to answer the question, what does that mean? So we're going to transition the first half of Mark's gospel. We are almost literally halfway through the book. Actually, I think we are literally halfway through the book. We want to say, who is Jesus? That's the first half of the book. Then the second half of the book is, what does that mean? So that's where we're going to pick up in the next video. I hope you stay tuned. And if you have any questions or comments, please let me know. Give me some feedback. I'd love to hear from you. Tell me what you're learning and how you're seeing Mark's gospel. I think it would be great for everyone. Have a great day, and God bless.